All right, welcome back after the lunch break. And we have divided this conference part exactly into two. So now we have a second session with twice as much speakers. I hope they very professionally manage to fit themselves into this. And this is why I'm not going to give a long speech here as an introduction, but go immediately to the speakers today. So 4 presentations, and we will a little bit change the focus to kind of museum organization, running museum organizations and different processes we are part of in the society. And I'm proud to introduce my dear colleague, Pille Pruulmann-Vengerfeldt, who has been part of our museum communication study group for years. And she represents today both our museum and Malmö University, living double lives. And I leave rest of the minutes to you to speak.
Thank you very much, and I am really proud and honored to be here at this conference talking about museum impact, museum relevance, and after the very powerful and impactful, let me say that word, and relevant introduction this morning, I'm going to go and come a little bit more down to earth, at least with some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about and present. So as Pille mentioned, I am a double agent working both in Estonian National Museum as a visiting researcher and as a professor in media and communication at the University of Malmö. And what brings me here is the Museum Events Measurement Impact on Local Environment with Data Analysis project. It's a MeMind project funded by Creative Europe. And together with our partners from Italy and Spain and Estonia, of course, we have been searching for ways in which we can understand museum impact in the best of ways. So, but to get going with the word impact, and there's been different introductions to this idea that museums are extremely impactful organizations already, and to give you a brief outline of why understanding impact or why understanding the position of any kind of institution is complicated. And that complication comes, this is a figure from our Australian National Science Agency, where they were trying to figure out how to understand the impact of science. And I would argue again that museums are also knowledge-making institutions, and therefore the understanding of impact, knowledge museum produce, or impact that creative industries have, can at least somewhat be sort of illustrated in this figure. So one of the things that is really, really important to distinguish here is to understand that what we do, what we put into an organization as inputs, what we do as activities, and what we have as results, as outputs, are the things that are under our control. This is what we can do. However, these are oftentimes really easy things to measure. These are the things that we have under our control. We can count them, we can keep tab of them. And I'm not saying that we always do measure them really well. There is another discussion that's going to help us to turn more our attention inwards, to understand what are we doing inside, to understand what impact or what relevance our outputs might have for the society. But it's also to really illustrate that even after we've had outputs, we've had exhibitions, we've had books published, we have websites, we have engagement on the social media, that is still not impact. It's a pathway to impact, and it's something that we can, again, measure and understand. And oftentimes we mix these things up as impact. We think that our outputs are impact. No, they're not. We think that our outputs are outcomes. Yes, our outputs lead to outcomes. They lead to people having been present at the exhibition. They lead to people having participated in the cultural programs. but we don't really know what kind of long-term impact that participation at that event might have had. And that's where we speculate, we hope, we dream, we build our aspirations on these things, and rightly so. But it's also to really, really take into account that they're not the same thing as, so outputs are not impact. Just a recent example from Swedish Academy, the political scientists were the first ones who were evaluated and they were also trying to figure out what's the impact of political science in Sweden. And one of the indicators, the measurement, they made a holistic case study-based evaluation, and one of the indicators they took in was how many grants had political scientists gotten. And if you look at this graph, it sort of blows your mind, because that's not anywhere near outputs or outcomes or impact. It's actually input. But this is just to sort of showcase that even with best of intentions, we sometimes confuse these things. How many funds we have raised is not an indicator of our impact, even if it's something that we value, appreciate, and really need to keep tab of. What is impact? What is museum impact? And here is another me bringing in knowledge from other people's work. A social impacts map that was done for the museums when they were, and in another European project where they were trying to measure a museum impacts. Here you can see that museums have intrinsic impacts on instrumental impacts, individual and societal impacts. And the things that range what museums can claim to have impact on. Urban regeneration, for instance. Estonian National Museum is a great example of urban regeneration happening when you put up a new building on a field and suddenly people want to live around that building. And they start complaining that the building is making too much noise. So there is, for instance, a way to have these impacts from, we have multiplier effects on local economy. We have personal learning. We have access to the past for our communities. We do different kinds of services, and some of these impacts are more, and some of these impacts are less easy to capture and less easy to understand. So with MeMind project, we set out to figure out how we can bring today's data science and our approach to the data into understanding, but how do we then sort of shift through that impact, and can we do something about this sense that we have these outputs, but we don't really know what our impacts are. And so one of the things that we started off with is to take a little bit of inventory of what is the data that culture and creative industries, that's the CCIs, what do the culture and creative industries have? What kind of data we have, and what kind of data we have access to? And there is, of course, a real important distinction here that there is loads of data in the creative industries. Some of the data that they are fully aware, other data is that it's there, but for instance, professionals in different parts of the house, they don't really recognize that this data in this one department really concerns me, who I work in the other department. I don't really necessarily have anything to do with that. Or we have also data that's publicly available in the public repositories. And I think when we started the project, our hopes and dreams were related to all of this open data. There is these movements around Europe that are making data sets available. But let me say, this was one of the sort of first things that we had to kind of like let go of our dreams. Is really hard to find relevant data sets from these open data sets that would help us to understand the museum impact, especially as the impact tends to, again, be the fuzzier and fuzzier the further away you come from outputs. So what we tried to do then was we did a data inventory. We looked at UNESCO cultural development indicators. There are 7 of these indicators which basically say if the country has this kind of pays this kind of attention to their culture and cultural resources, it's going to be good for the country. And we thought maybe we can use the same indicators to also understand whether the individual institution, and we worked, in addition to Estonian National Museum, we also had Internet Festival from Pisa to do that investigation. So we did a very open exploration. We came up with 97 indicators for different kind of data. And then we said, okay, we have to stop because that's sort of not necessarily leading us anywhere, because 97 is a really impressive number. And I guess that if we would have spent a few more weeks, we would have easily gotten to 150, maybe 200 indicators. But it's also, okay, but what do we do with these numbers? Where do we go from these numbers? And that's maybe some of the sort of less enthusiastic part of my talk leads to that part. Because, for instance, one of these things that we have is that we have sometimes an abundance of data. We have, and this is a random image from internet, so it doesn't have to make sense necessarily. It's a Google Analytics image. But I just wanted to show that Google Analytics gives us a sense that we have so much data. And it's so interesting. You can draw graphs ups and downs, and you have longer bars and shorter bars, and they're pretty as well. But can we really make sense of this data? Can this data really help us to understand what is the impact our institutions have? And here it's to also be critical and skeptical that not always is an abundance of data really something that helps us further in understanding what we do. Because another question is that can we trust this data? Can we understand what this data is saying? And this is an example another example from our project. Those more versed in recognizing reading maps will recognize that this is Estonian National Museum. And this is this is pathways through Estonian National Museum taken with different language cards. And this is a wonderful illustration, which again is based on data. It gives us hard data about when people clicked, which language cards were clicked at which objects. They give us data that, for instance, that red person who was using Finnish language cards spent 100 minutes at the exhibition. At least that's 100 minutes between the first click and the last click. We don't really know if they left after the last click. Or we don't really know whether after clicking they actually spent time reading the stuff. But we have these data traces, and we were trying to make sense of these data traces and bring this to our own attention. And interestingly, these data traces, luckily for us, they actually confirmed our observations to a large extent. So it's also about finding ways in which we can make this data to be complementary to each other. The other thing that we can also ask is, can we be creative with the data we have? And this is another spiel for what's going to happen later today. We are opening an exhibition a few hundred meters that way, basically. And here we asked ourselves, can we be creative with the data, and will that enhance our understanding of what's going around? Or will that challenge the way we can implement that database discussions and these database decisions in our general cultural institution ways? And I think here, one of the conclusions that we came up with is that data can and should be at least sometimes made tangible, because people tend to have a bit of apprehension around large numbers. The graphs on this look much more impressive and also much more intimidating, let's say, compared to figures that you can touch and play around and think about. But it's also very much that when we have access to different kind of cultural indicators, when we have access to different kind of data, it's the reflexivity, but it's also the our own institutional expertise that we need to bring in, and that we need to really say, okay, we are experts of our own knowledge domain, and as experts of our own knowledge domain, we can claim ownership of that knowledge and of that material. So as a final sort of point, I really wanted to sort of bring you a few ideas. How can cultural and creative industries update their work with data to understand their impact? So here are 5 lessons learned, or 5 questions to ask yourself. So first of all, it is important to understand the difference between primary and secondary data, between quantitative and qualitative data. Primary and secondary data, it's the data that you collect yourself for your own purposes with the ideas that you want to have. And secondary data is the data that someone else is collecting. And that secondary data is also something to really consider when we use secondary data. Whose interest does it serve? Is it the interest of you as a cultural institution? Is it the interest of global technology players? Is it the interest of city? Is it the interest of the state? Whose interest does this data collection serve? And are we doing service for ourselves to trusting those other people's interest, trusting that data that's collected with other people's agenda in our own institutions? It's also important to understand the difference, what is being done and what impact it might have. That, again, the output that is not impact. And it's not necessarily wrong for us to focus on outputs and work with outputs and put our heart and soul and attention to outputs. But it's misleading to claim that because we've made so much effort, that we also have had, therefore, so much impact. So A for effort does not necessarily mean that also we have achieved what we set out to do. Another really important part that I think our exercise had is to have an overview of the data already being collected both internally and externally. That kind of data inventory or internal audit to really sort of think, okay, what are the things that we know? What are the things that we could be knowing? What are the things that we would like to know? That kind of critical inventory might be really revealing in terms of hidden resources, but also sometimes unrealistic questions or our own unrealistic aspirations. And then finally, structure and organize internal data to answer questions concerning your organization. Again, you don't always need to go outside. You don't always need to start from finding external data. I had a wonderful example of a project that I heard was from a US city, and the project owner, a data scientist, had made this question about whether the fact that museums were less visited by minority communities was due to the fact that transport networks did not reach the museum community or did not link the places where the minorities lived with the museums. So she did this, she took the city's transport network study, the museum visiting study, and mapped the routes and did really wonderful data science and came away with the conclusion, no, that was not the answer. So sometimes we can't have to really sort of say the fact that we have also as data analysis put in a lot of effort to understand the data, it does not necessarily mean that we then have the answer that we're looking for. So that was my 5 points, 5 takeaway lessons from our project, and also my time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any short questions? We have been working with this project for months, so we can have long conversations also later, but I can't see any hands. Okay. In this case, because I'm saving time by not asking you questions, I'm saying thank you. Okay. And there is a chance to talk about it at the coffee break. And or at our exhibition opening, which is linked to the same project. And we will open with last survivors from this day, hopefully later on. But now I am glad to ask another presenter from Eesti Vabaõhumuuseum, Estonian Open Air Museums, to talk also about the development of museums and cultural institutions. And as a short introduction, I can also say that Rasmus combines different fields. His interest is both in belt heritage and impacted-oriented development of the museum. So let's see if he manages to put it together. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind words. My experience in the field of visitor experience and visitor studies and impact of museums began here in the Estonian National Museum 4 years ago at ICOM conference with a very spirited talk by Wayne Modest. So thank you for this opportunity to see, to step back from the desk, from the doom and gloom of the daily work, and to reflect for a moment on where have I gotten in that time. Excellent. Yes. So I will start with an overview. 2 years ago, I had the fortune to spend a bit of time with the development plans of Estonian museums. It is a principal strategic document that almost every museum has. And I picked a sample of 25 of them just to get an overview, a representation of various contexts of public, private, rural, urban, small, large museums. And I focused on the mission statements, vision statements, strategic development goals, assessment metrics. So 3 overall topics, the elements of the core of the development plans, and tried to make a sense of what the bird's eye view of the current state of what museums are doing, what they state that they are doing is. So I revisited that study with keeping in mind the social value and impact, what is told about it and what is currently visible in those documents in that field. So in a broad sense, we can distinguish between 3 types of definitions, 3 types of mission statements. There are many different phrasings of how to define what the museum is, does, or what its goals are. But most of them should fall under these 3 categories. They are not to be used in strict theoretical sense, because in all the mission statements they had either 2 or 3 elements combined, and so the categories are a bit subjective, as I divided the museums into stricter types. So the first type is institution-centered. And the definition of what a museum is at the core, or the institution is at the core of the description. So it is either a museum is a leading center of research and propagating topic of some history. It is a well-known and visited tourist destination, or this or that, or reliable, trustworthy memory institution. There are activity-based definitions. So we all recognize the influence of ICOM definition of museum in here. The museum is an institution that acquires, conserves, researches, exhibits, heritage on whatever theme the museum is actually current in. And there are actually only 1/3 of museums that state their goal towards a more general outcome or desired impact. We would like to inspire or interest people in our topic. We would like to offer a unique experience for our visitors, or even to make the world a better place. And here are some examples, some of my favorites. For example, the Estonian Sports and Olympics Museum, it does nothing less than improve the world. But already here, when you start to look between the mission statements and the vision statements, and we will come to the metrics in a short while, you can start to see some gaps. When the mission is to change the world into a better place, and the vision of it is to increase 5 times the revenue of the museum in 5 years, there's something amiss between those goals and the ways they are achieved. And this is a general overview of metrics that are used in development plans in Estonian museums. And they further deepen the sense that what is measured, what is being thought of as important, is misaligned with the general goals of what those museums aim to achieve at times. These mission statements were gathered, and the data on these types of metrics used was gathered in 2020. So they're outdated. I believe the museums, the proportion of those who are stating their missions more in terms of social action, social value, has increased in time. And also the number of museums that actively take interest in visitor experience, for instance. So it's not all doom and gloom in the sense. You shouldn't take this at face value. And I definitely, there is an improvement. And and I also should remind you that development plans are not everything a museum does. Museums have their strategic plans, they have their particular actions, and there are a lot of exhibitions and educational programs, other activities that are individually more in a more pronounced way dealing with social impact, social values, but in more general terms, in the development plans, that shift, that awareness rising that has happened in the past years, definitely it has taken place. It is not still visible there yet. Apologies. So I think there are 3 types of hurdles for integrating the social impact theoretical frameworks and ideals into development plans I'd like to discuss in detail. And I remember vividly the first time that in the Estonian Open Air Museum, when I first spoke to a larger audience about we should gear our museum towards social impact or influence. And I saw the confused faces of the audience. And later on, I understood that their confusion was due to 2 separate problems or oppositions to the notions that I put forth. First was that we already have everything that is of value. We have our heritage, we have our exhibitions, we have our educational programs. What else do we need? We already put forth that value to the society. We're not doing it for ourselves. So we are already impactful. There's no problem that you're trying to address here. And the second one is, yes, there are major social upheavals, there are problems with the environment, but we're just a small museum. How should our work relate to that, our daily work? The problems are immense, they're immeasurable almost, and our small exhibition, small room, there's no connection between those two. There's a huge gap between them. And the third, even if we did realize that we should work towards these general goals and have them in our minds in whatever we do, how do we know that we're actually moving or changing anything? So these are the issues I encountered when I started to first talk about how to implement social impact in the Estonian Open Air Museum. I will get to the case of the Estonian Open Air Museum. Our mission is to inspire and teach people of the value and of the value of rural built heritage, and to responsibly preserve and to appreciate the traditional lifestyle. And our vision is to be a visitor-friendly rural architectural museum, but also that through our actions, people take more interest in the roots and Estonian tangible and intangible cultural heritage. This mission and vision statement was put forth before I took up a managerial position. So I found myself in a task of trying to make sense of these broader goals and to keep them at the same time grounded within what the museum is doing in its daily work. So this is still very much a work in progress. But through visitor studies, through surveys, I have started to collect additional data on what the status of vernacular architecture in Estonian society currently is. And we know now that in terms of value attitudes, if we ask yes or no question from the general population of Estonia, do you consider vernacular architecture an important part of cultural heritage? Then the 87% says yes. So we know that we are valued. And if you ask, are you interested in Estonian rural history and culture, then 55% says yes. So we know at least that the topic that we're dealing with is relevant to this society. There is a more tangible measurement of impact that we're currently developing. It's trying to research what the current state of vernacular architecture in Estonia in general is. We know that there are 55,000 buildings built before 1945 in rural areas in Estonia. We don't know what state they're in, we don't know what heritage values they exhibit. So if we get a sense of that, and in time we can start to assess the impact of our work having on the conservation of those heritage values in time. There are still a lot of gaps. There's never enough data. We have the resources to ask these questions about the value and reputation, to do these top-of-mind surveys once a year. But by now we know that if we combine all the communications work that we do, the number of contacts that we reach through our advertisement, marketing, publications, and so forth, we get to around 12 million contacts a year. We don't know if the person actually read the article, but we know they clicked on it. So we know that that's the reach that we, through our communication efforts, we managed to come to. From there, we know that it takes around 200 to 300 these connections or reaches to translate into an engagement in terms of a museum visit. So from there on, we know the conversion rate of our communication work into engagements with our museum. We also know that in terms of top-of-mind survey, just one question. Name 3 museums in Estonia that you know. We know that last year only 4.5% of the audience named Estonian Open Air Museum. But we know the next year it was 9.8 through our communication work. So it took around 1.25 million contacts to increase the top-of-mind reputation of Estonian Open Air Museum by 1%. and there's a huge leap between the engagements and the reputation, and how does that translate into social change, into change in values. And I think here only time will tell, because if we do it annually, we can see what the trends are, what our outputs and what our inputs are, and how these shifts change. But as Pille said, then there's a lot of air between visiting and having an actual experience of the museum, change of mind, and then measuring through a questionnaire in general, in a more broad sense. There is a method that was presented in 2018 by the London Design Museum. They had educational programs for children on design thinking. And what they did, they found those children 10 years later. And then they asked, do you remember that you were at our educational program? Has it had any impact on you? And in what field do you work right now? Are you an architect? Do you use the design thinking that was given to you? So there are ways of measuring those impacts directly also. But it's difficult, to say the least. So these are the hurdles that we're still working to overcome. But I would like to finish with a thought. A couple of weeks ago, we had a board meeting. As usual, business as usual. A lot of topics, a lot of problems. The mind starts to wander, thinking about my own work that I have to do. And then suddenly, one of the colleagues says that we're starting a project on green museums. We're joining that initiative. And I do a quick calculus of how many man hours will be there, what does it financially take from us. We don't have the manpower to do the projects that we already have at hand. And my first impulse is to say out loud, maybe we should not do it. Maybe we should focus on what we're currently doing. There's a lot of changes in our institution going right now, where our bookkeeping is changing their software, and there's a lot on people's table. And the colleague answers to me, if we don't do it, then why are we doing the rest of the things that we do? So I'm hoping to see that social values find their way into development plans of Estonian museums more and more in the future. And that we, despite all the difficulties of assessing and measuring the impact, we still try to find models on how to do it. Because if we don't, then what's the alternative to it? Thank you.
So some feedback from the audience, brief questions. Someone is checking the watch. So thank you very much for this talk. It is always good that if there are people who take time. I know our marketing departments are really busy, but I'm always glad if someone tries to explain this complex way, because also visitor satisfaction surveys have no relevance if we don't do this all you showed. So thanks. There are more people like this. I know our organization sometimes ask why we struggle with that, but I'm glad you're doing the work. Thank you. So questions during the coffee break then to Rasmus. And I will move here, the other microphone, using this microphone. So we have one more talk from the museum in Tallinn from Vabamu, and it is in fact linking also to the talk by Raivis. So, but we split that up, so these topics are going kind of circular. So Karen Jagodin is the CEO of Vabamu. Vabamu has a lot of things on its plate, and it was already brought up as an introduction by you earlier. So Karen, please, where are you? Here, yes. So I give you the floor, and also because you are a very new CEO, you can also have an additional introduction regarding how you identify yourself. And as we are moving from one topic to another, I'm really glad that Vabamu was actually recently part of also of our self-evaluation and impact development. So there are kind of lucky or kind of happy victims to our efforts. So Karen, please, the floor is yours here.
Good afternoon. A pleasure to be here. Yes, I joined the team of Vabamu in the middle of 2019, but for 2.5 years I was involved in a different position as a member of the board. And now, just starting from the 1st of April, I'm then on the position of the CEO. So it's such a new news that we haven't had yet time to release the press release. So it's my first official talk as the director of Vabamu. Did something happen? Yeah, it did. When I started to think about how we are engaging with the topics relevant in the society, I very quickly came back to the core values and the main story of our museum, because everything we do is very strongly and interconnected with our core values, our main mission. It comes strongly also from the specifics that which makes us a bit different on the Estonian museum sector, that we are a private museum. We have a founding family, a foundation. We have a daughter of the woman who founded the museum as our mission guardian, actively participating in the museum development. So we do have this very strong connection to the reason why the museum was created in the first place, what is the main mission of the museum, and everything we do, everything we decide where we want to have impact on or what is relevant for us, it goes through the filter of the museum mission, of the values we have. And 2 of the 4 core values, compelling past, touching stories, inclusive discussions, vibrant opinion. The inclusive discussions and vibrant opinions already both have very strong indications to relevance, that you want to see what is relevant in the society, how we can reflect that, what kind of role we can have in it. And this is something we are having all the time discussions about, that what is our role in it? How active, how passive should we be? Is it more about being a platform, bringing together people for discussions and opinions? How much we should ourselves give out opinions and be strong in communicating, taking sides or showing our strong opinion. So this is something that we really discuss in everything we do. Inclusion, honesty, optimism is something that is also core values around everything we decide to do. So I think this gives a kind of a hint of the mental space where we operate and based on what we make our decisions. Which also leads us sometimes to the question, what is Vabamu? As it was referred to before, when it was founded with the name of Museum of Occupations. The name was broadened to the Museum of Occupations and Freedom 4 years ago, with the new title Vabamu as well. Estonians and people who work in the museum field know very well that this change did not go very easily. It brought along a lot of emotions, a lot of disagreements. And as commented earlier here in the morning session, it was a decision made by the museum, by the organization, but the public reacted very strongly and very actively. So it means to me now that whenever you want to do something that is really relevant in the society, you want to have an impact, it might come with the cost of people disagreeing with you and having very strong arguments. Were there mistakes made in the way the change was communicated? I guess so. But also now, whenever we work with the name of the museum, when we work with the relevance, we still have to think a lot about the different communities around the museum and what is relevant to them, because when you want to widen the perspective and reach out to more communities, the former communities might feel left out, that they are not anymore relevant. But for us, having wider relevance does not mean that we are excluding the communities that were relevant before. So one of the changes that was tried to put through was that we are not only concentrating on past, on occupations, but talking about occupations. When you talk about occupations, you are talking also about freedom. You are talking about the lack of freedom. And you are talking about what freedom then means. So is it then the home of freedom? Is it an incubator for the future of freedom? Is it a foundation standing for freedom? These are not official names of the organizations, but this is the mind space or the game with the titles we have been having in trying to articulate also to ourselves. What does it mean then? What is the freedom part in our museum name? And when, after the museum change, it felt very strongly that in the society, if we want to be relevant, we have to talk more engagingly about the present freedom, interconnected with the past and history. Then this has again shifted and changed very quickly due to the current circumstances and the war going on in Europe. So suddenly, when for years we have been feeling that we are strongly moving towards more emphasizing on the freedom part in our program, because we have the occupations part very well covered with our museum expositions, both in Vabaõhumuuseum and the KGB prison cells, in the memorializing events, the public programming that we are having, the school groups and the educational programs. Then just the start of the war in Ukraine brought Olga's story, who was born in Kiev and left Estonia in 1944 as a young lady, a war refugee to US, and then afterwards in 1998 founded the museum. It brought her story back into a completely different perspective, and a new relevance was given to actually the founding story of the museum and the history connected to her personal story. So we are always balancing and looking the way how to, the two topics that are so interconnected, what is the relevance at the moment in the society, where to put the emphasis, because we have heard now back from several people that within the last 2 months, people have started to think it's mostly people whose children are now adults or young adults, that they brought their kids who were born in the beginning of 1990s up so that they didn't really talk much about recent history, Second World War, or the dark side of that part of our history, because they thought that it will never happen again. We don't want to burden our kids with this negative story from our history. And now suddenly the tables have turned. They think that this is one of the greatest mistakes I have done. I should bring this knowledge closer to my family, to my kids, because they have been taken freedom so for granted that we don't really having the connections to the history that Estonia and our families have experienced. They are lacking a connection to understand what is currently going on in Ukraine. So what we have done now to stay relevant in the context of freedom and occupations. A few years back, as I mentioned, as we are a private museum, we have a very active supervisory council. The supervisory council members and the members of the leadership team at the museum had meetings with the leaders of all Estonian political parties. and several other opinion leaders, advisors, journalists, and fished for ideas for how do you think Estonia would, as a society, profit? What's something that you feel that is not so relevant in the big picture in Estonia, where we should put our emphasis? And the two ideas that came up very strongly have now led to our new activities. The first that came out from those meetings was that the youngsters need to be socially more engaged. If you are about 13 to 17-year-old young person and you want to be active in the society, you don't have much choice where to go, what to do, and you usually end up in the political parties' youth movements, which means that you are very soon also part of the party and you are politically included in one worldview. But you have a neutral, safe place where to discuss about topics that are relevant to you, what is going on in the society. There is a lack of that space. And out of this input, we created NOVA, the Youth Engagement for Vabamu, which is a self-learning platform, but also a programming agenda oriented towards youngsters who are socially engaged, who want to have discussions, who want to think along, who want to understand better, but also want to self-learn and in the future hopefully also become creators of self-contributors, creators of the content that NOVA is providing. So we have created already 100 different study bites to the NOVA platform, the web page. We engage a lot of content that we have already created in the museum to the content that have been created by our partners, and we are all the time trying to find connections with the school curriculums so that it would be a tool also for teachers if they want to have extracurricular material to engage their school children to topics that are currently under discussion. So as you can see also from this one screenshot, there are study bites about historical events to make them more understandable in the current environment and relevance, but also about very contemporary topics that are important right now to youngsters. I wanted to show you with this slide just a very detailed view on how we then in practice look at our impacts and our aim. So as was very nicely put out here previously, it's very easy to measure metrics, easy to measure how many visitors we have, how many subscribers, how many talks have been held. But we always want to keep also the impact, what we are then in a bigger picture trying to achieve next to that. So with the platform development, with creating those study bites, what we actually want to have impact in the society is to have innovation in educational technology. Clearly, a lot about it is empowering youngsters so that they become more active participants in the society. How do we measure it now? How do we get back the feedback that as it really happened, as already Rasmus pointed out, it's very hard to measure, it's very hard to see. Maybe really in 10 years' time somebody comes back and says, and that when I was in the 7th grade and came to your talk about human rights, I made a choice and this has affected me. But right now it's very difficult to say that, but this is what we want to achieve. Of course, discussions, empowering and active content creators. So we keep these all the time under our eyes and quarterly have then follow-ups about how we are doing. Do we need to change something? Is the impact proven or does it need anything to be changed? The other direction that came out very specifically from these talks with government leaders, party leaders, was that extra to youngsters, what Estonia really needs is very good global connections, because having good global connections and economical connections is something that can keep Estonia free. It's something that can have a very strong impact on the way our society develops. And as we are And museum that already has a very strong international network. Stanford University Libraries is one of our main partners. We have their representative in our supervisory council. Then piece by piece, we are now starting to put together a global connection development plan. So how we as a museum can have relevance in the global scale and have impact on the connections that are benefiting Estonia. So what it means in practice, so for example, we are partnering up with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications and Tartu University to bring in to Estonia the CDL, the Creative Disruption Lab, which is a prominent hub for research and tech entrepreneurs to have a new extra developmental phase being created with their very high-ranking mentors, and it's coming to Estonia now first in autumn to Tartu. So it's much more about being a partner and being a platform and being part of the network where we can then have the impact and where we can have really relevance. So it just came to my mind that, for example, a few weeks back, about a month back, John Rendon was visiting Estonia. He's a well-known strategical communication specialist from US, and he has worked with all US presidents for decades already. And we helped him organize a schedule where he could meet different Estonian people because he wanted to have a clear on-site view into how we are feeling here in connection to regarding the events, the war going on in Ukraine and so on. And one of the things he took out from the meetings when he went back to the US and met the Congress members was that US should immediately appoint an ambassador to Estonia, because we haven't had a US ambassador for three years already. So is this something that we can say that the museum has had a little impact on if the US ambassador will now in recent future be appointed to Estonia? I don't know, but we had our little part in putting him together with the people. And this is something where we feel that we can help and we can have impact, that we can be part of these kinds of things. And to end with, I just wanted to further a bit reflect on the Museum of Impact, the MOI project, where, as Pille referred to, where we were one of the piloting museums. So we had the chance to pilot the self-evaluation method. And what we took out of it was that as a museum who is dealing with recent history, human rights, freedom, we are very well aware of our role and impact that we can have in the society. What role do we have? What role we can have and want to have? How we promote and support democratic development? Do we have actions to support that? And so on and so on. So I think these are the things that we found very easily that, yes, we are not really struggling with it. With what we are, where we have space for growth is clearly communication. We think that we communicate very clearly what we do and what we want to do, but it's always not delivered that way, and it's not taken that way. And we clearly don't reach all the communities in the communicational way that they would understand us. We think that we are very open to all kinds of ways of points of views, political ways of thinking, world views. But if I look at our team, we are actually very, very similar. We don't have much diversity in our own team, although we are very open to discussions and different partners, collaboration to different partners. But our team itself is not very diverse. We pretty much think the same way. With collections and research, we have tried to find links to being more relevant in the society, and I think the last really important step in the development of that phase is that we want to start collecting digital heritage, digital history, the Estonian digital story within the last 30 years when Estonia has become digital society, and the e-success story. So we try to find the links where collecting and research can make more relevance. But But definitely we have a lot to dig into regarding really thorough knowledge about the audiences, the communities, and also how to reach them and how to communicate with them. The last point about finances, that they are not maybe that transparent, isn't really meaning that there is some scheming going on in the museum. It's something that we really come across very much because we are a private museum and we have to fundraise for basically everything we do. Yes, we are also partly funded by the Ministry of Culture, and I'm extremely grateful for that annual support, but it covers only a quarter, not more than now post-COVID times, a third of the budget, which means that all the developmental projects, all programming, all exhibitions have to be fundraised. And what this means is that very often we come across that if there is funds available, you want to take the funds because you really need the funds, but this influences what you're actually going to do. You don't always get funds for what you want to do, but you might get funds for something that is there on the table, but it shifts your focus away to something else that was not actually currently a priority. So it's always it's balancing and finding the way how to link your goals and your relevance to also the finances that are available, because we are very vulnerable in this sense that we really need to fundraise for everything we want to do. Just to end with, one of the quotes I took out from the MOI sheets after we had done the self-evaluation with our team was that actually being relevant needs bravery, at least in our museum and in what we do. It comes across that people start to talk about it as something being brave, that if we want to really have impact in the society and if we want to be in discussion with the topics and events that are currently going on in the society, then it needs bravery. But are our actions braver than our words, or the opposite? So what's actually braver? Where we have more impact in the words or in the actions? And this is something we really think a lot about, because even now when after the 24th of February, 5 days after the war started in Ukraine, all of our museum staff members got one of the first letters about how think about leaving the country. We will be coming and changing the museum to being actually relevant and talking about the history and the way it should be. So we are pointing to the topics that are relevant in the society, and we have to be aware of the diversity that is around the way people see and approach us. So yes, it does need sometimes bravery to be relevant in the society and do relevant things as a museum. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you a lot. Chance for a short question. No. I can't see it as well. Hello.
Hi, thank you for this, and I just owe to show my appreciation of what you. Like 5 years ago on this stage, there was this announcement that the museum is planning to go this for the change of name, and then there was this huge public debate, and it's really my appreciation that you did this, and you honestly show it as an optimistic vision for this country and for the continent. And I think this institution, there must be one in Baltic which takes that optimistic view in it, and there must be somebody who is playing a hardball, like a Museum of Occupation in Riga, being at the forefront of memory battles. And just how much different is this optimistic view now compared to 5 years ago, when we looked at the Copenhagen and how free this society is and how we wish to resemble them here in the Baltic, and for you being here practically next door to the Finland and Scandinavia, which is so much has influenced your way of life and thinking. to what extent do you see this view of your optimistic vision of freedom changing the society? Or maybe the question is, in what term do you expect the society get more free and more liberal in that sense? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's. I think one of the things we have come across while now analyzing backwards where we stand and in comparison to the different museums in the Baltic countries or in the Nordics, as you said, it's good to have museums who also look back only to the hard stories in the history. I think what happened a bit with Vabamu was also that a lot of communities in Estonia put this expectation on Vabamu, but Vabamu has been since the beginning a private museum with its founder's mission, and this mission was very strongly since the beginning oriented towards freedom. As you already referred to Lennart Meri's speech, the Freedom's House. So the concept of being more seen as a Nordic international global institution that looks forward has always been integrated into the very idea why this museum was created. But there was a very strong need for museums who would tell about Second World War human rights, their dark history in the society in 1990s. So, and where elsewhere, usually these museums were founded by the state, by the country. Then in Estonia, this isn't happened. We don't have the national museum for these topics. We have Vabamu. So I think there was a collision of expectations also as well a bit. And but we are guarding the mission that was given to us by Olga, and that's why it has been integrated since the beginning, that we actually look more towards the Nordic or the global way of understanding what freedom is about, or how you look at occupations, always through the perspective of having freedom, lack of it or having it.
Thank you.
Yes, but as a comment rather than a question. I think that it has been interesting how in Estonia, yes, there have been always throughout your museum operations that there are expectations to kind of this memorialization and dark heritage dominating in a very dark sense. But today, when we saw this word optimism on it, I think that maybe when you change your format, you didn't miscommunicate as you kind of proposed, but maybe this freedom and optimism as a word should have been communicated in the beginning, because never again is full of this hope and optimism, isn't it? The question part is, isn't it? So.
It is.
All right, thank you. We have to proceed. Thank you once more. There is also a thank you, a little chocolate to you. Thanks a lot for coming. And I quickly step up to introduce the next speaker here. So Pirjo Hamari comes from Finnish Heritage Board, and you have been working there for a long time in different positions as a heritage expert, and your current role is Director of Development at Museum Development Unit. Yes, and again, we are kind of showcasing our collaborations here today as a celebration of our 60th conference. So I'm glad, as you have already figured out, that this international collaboration for European-wide museum development, which you are leading, that we are part of that. But I'm really glad that you could come and talk about it yourself. So the floor is yours. Here you are.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm the last presenter today, so hopefully you still have some energy left, and I'm not standing too much between you and the coffee break and the exhibition opening. I was wondering whether to say that I'm going to be more practical or more boring than the previous presentation. Hopefully not, because we are basically talking about the same thing, which is impacts and relevance of the museums, and I will come back to that at the end of my presentation. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is our project museum, Museums of Impact. Those of you who have some knowledge of Finnish might also know that moi means hello. We try to also connect this openness and collaborative aspect in thinking about museums together. But basically what we have in the MOI Museums of Impact project is a Creative Europe funded cooperation program that we are doing together with the Estonian National Museum and 10 other partners in 8 countries across Europe. And what the project is about, it's about developing a European museum self-evaluation framework that should work for all kinds and sizes of museums as a tool for internal development, which has impact at its core. It's a fairly simple project with a number of typical project activities. One of our key elements in developing this framework has been of course, the cooperative aspect with partners, but also a discussion with the museum fields, museum regions in Europe, out of which this is one of the discussions, and also piloting the framework, draft framework that we currently have in different museums. And Karen was really making a very fine case of what kind of benefits we can get when this is tested in a real-life environment. Of course, the self-evaluation framework idea is not born out of nothing. There are previous examples in Europe how to evaluate your activities or develop your activities through frameworks. We've had a Finnish self-evaluation model for the last 10 years, slightly longer, and there are other examples as well, like the AIM hallmarks, and also others which we've used as a basis. But basically how the framework has been developed up until now is based on the discussions with the different museum regions and our understanding of what impact currently is, how it's understood in museums, and how we could develop museums towards more impact. I will start with some underlying concepts of the framework and basically concentrate on 2 aspects. That is developmental evaluation as a tool and impact for museums. And when we talk about evaluation, this is theoretically, we know there are different ways of evaluating. One of the most common and also presented by Pille is how we evaluate something that's already been produced, an outcome evaluation or an impact evaluation, something that examines the results of an intervention. That's usually how people think about evaluation. There are other evaluation types as well, but the conceptual basis of our self-evaluation framework is something that is called developmental evaluation. So when you think about our evaluation framework, you should understand that at its core are these 2 ideas, that it is a self-evaluation, it's a look at yours, it's the look that you direct at yourself as an institution. And also that developmental evaluation is intended as an evaluation that helps you to develop an activity. So self-evaluation is a process of observing, analyzing, and improving one's own actions or results. And basically, and if I summarize what you already see on the screen. And developmental evaluation is an evaluation that assists in development and change processes. When we talk about the MOI framework for museums, what we try to emphasize or how people usually approach it is, okay, this is a framework that will help us evaluate our impact in society, because these kinds of tools are really needed, necessary. People are looking for tools that would help us justify why we exist, for whom we exist, and legitimize and make us accountable for actions. This is exactly the kind of evaluation Pille was talking about, and also something that she mentioned that it's really difficult to come to, and therefore there's a really big need for these kinds of models for evaluating your impact. I'll try to explain to people that you should not be disappointed in the MOI self-evaluation, although this doesn't help you to evaluate your outcomes or your impact. What we are doing with the self-evaluation framework is to help you take a look at your own activities and inside your organizations, help to develop it to be a stronger and more knowledgeable, more accountable organization. And by being a stronger organization, we can almost guarantee that you will have bigger impact in society. Specifically, as this framework looks at everything through the lens of impact. So one basic approach or underlying concept that needs to be underlined is that this developmental evaluation is not about measuring things, it's about developing things. And the second underlying concept is the idea of impact. We've talked about impact a lot today, so I really don't need to go into more detail about that. There has been echoes of this throughout all of the presentation that have been given today. The key issues in impact is that it's a change that you want to be or want to make in the society, and this has to be unique for each and every museum and museum environment. This was emphasized by Jette, for example. It's a dialogue between the institution and the surrounding society and environment. And in order to have impact, you have to have goals. There can't be any change unless you know where you want to go. So impact goals are the basics of creating impacts or making a change. And it's up to the museum itself to define the change that they want to be, the reason and they want to make change and for whom the museum exists. And that will form the basis of how we can be impactful and also how we can have relevance in society. And this turns to the look of impact from evaluating impact to evaluating for impact using this kind of a self-evaluation framework. You've also seen the image of this impact value chain. It's fundamental for understanding how impact works. It had slightly different headlines in Pille's presentation, but basically it's about the same thing. We have some resources and input. We have activities that lead to outputs, and those outputs are turned into outcomes, which in turn create impact. This image is from the Europeana Impact Playbook. Some of you might be familiar with this tool that helps you also to design impact for your organization. But it's a practical visualization to explain where in the impact value chain our self-evaluation framework works. So while those kinds of frameworks or evaluations that measure outcomes or even impact work at the end of the impact value chain, the MOI self-evaluation framework is active at the beginning of the impact value chain or towards the beginning of the impact value chain. So it's taking a look, helping you to evaluate the things that you do or the things that we do. It's looking at the activities and helping you to self-evaluate those, how well we are doing in things. Are we doing the things that we want? Is our organization capable of creating impact because of our processes, structures, activities, and the goals that we want to work towards? And it helps you to answer the question or look at the question, if we are doing the things right. If you are doing things right, to doing the right things. So it turns the lookout to what you should be doing instead of, and how you should do things instead of the outcomes. And when we think about the different frameworks, in which European museums work in, European-wide, we know there are accreditation systems or registration systems. They are mostly about quality. If there is a sufficient level of professionalism in the workings of a museum. Then there's also measuring and accountability. We all know that institutions are nowadays expected to, at least on some level, to show how they are accountable for the resources that have been put into use. So we propose that this MOI self-evaluation framework could work well and does work well as a complementary system for all these kinds of other evaluation methods or frameworks. And putting them all together would be a really strong support for museums of impact or museums having impact in society. And for the actual methodology of doing a self-evaluation exercise, we have a self-evaluation framework present. It's basically a series of impact statements that the organization is asked to evaluate based on their self-understanding and a dialogue within the organization. You saw examples of the question in Karen's presentation, but what this kind of a self-evaluation frame, what kinds of topics it is addressing is, for example, do you know your operating environment and are you in a dialogue with it? Do you allow it to impact your operations? How about our services? Are they answering the needs of our communities and our environment? For whom and with whom are the services planned and carried out? How about our resources? Are they put in the best possible use to improve the impact of operations? What's our operating culture? What are our working practices that enable us to have an impact? These are the kinds of areas that the self-evaluation framework touches upon. And the actual framework is divided into currently, as it's only a draft at this point, currently divided into 8 modules. We have 4 enabler modules, which basically help you to understand how we as an institution become a museum of impact. Those 4 enabler modules look at what we do, how we work, how our organization functions, and how we embed the digital in our operations. And the 4 impact modules are looking at the different areas of museums having impact and how can we learn to be better in these areas. I suppose these are the most interesting modules out of the model for you here at the Relevance conference. And the content and the topics of these impact modules come directly from our discussion with the different European museum regions, from the museum professionals who have an understanding of their environment and the dialogue and the direction they would like to take their museums when they think about the interface between museums and impact. And these topics are societal relevance, communities and shared heritage, sustainable and resilient societies, and relevant and reliable knowledge. All of them include a number of statements related to that topic, which the museum can use. And of course, since it's a modular, you can use from one up to as many modules that you like to do. And well, basically, it's up to the museum to decide how they want to use this model and where they think they would like to go first. And currently, again, this is just a draft, but just to give you a very practical example, what a self-evaluation framework means is that we have a module where we have an explanation about what this is about and why is societal relevance important for museums. There is a scale for evaluation, and then there are the impact statements that the museum is asked to evaluate. And the examples that we have here in the societal relevance module are, for example, a statement saying when the topic is strategic choices and objectives that we have considered where and how we can be relevant in society. How true is this in your society? Does it work in practice? It's being evaluated and developed, and is a particular strength as far as the operations are concerned. Then you would self-evaluate your level at 5, and so forth. And going through these statements gives you an idea. So I was going before myself. So this is the framework, and it of course will be accompanied by guidelines, ways, explanations of how to use it, reference material, a glossary, and also provides you a way of doing a development plan for your museum. But basically what the self-evaluation model gives you is an insight into where you find your strengths and where you have room for development. And then it's up to the museum to decide where to go from here. Of course, the expectation is that this will lead to a development. And it's, of course, we strongly emphasize and support that. But it's up to the museum to decide the next steps. There are possibilities for selecting your strengths and playing more against them, or then addressing some of the topics that you've identified in your internal dialogue and jointly decided that this is a very important topic, but we don't feel that we are addressing it as well as we could. And then taking some of the topics that you've identified in the self-evaluation and building on those in your development plan. This is a summary of that process, very simply put, that you have a process of dialogue inside your organization with the help of the framework. You identify areas where there is room for development and start the development path based on the evaluation results. And through this kind of a process, we believe that this will lead to increased impact in society. That was basically the methodology of the MOI framework and developmental self-evaluation that lies under this model. And I wanted to end my presentation by bringing us back to relevance, value, and impact. I've of course talked about the methodology of doing a self-evaluation and a tool for development or tool for developing your organization. But I wanted to emphasize that, of course, underlying everything this is the idea that museums are relevant in today's society and they can have an impact. Jette was talking about value-based organizations, or looking at how museums exist and what they are for through values. And it's clear, even though it's not about the self-evaluation framework is not about educating how museums should be or providing a quality framework what makes a good museum. It's not value-free either. There are clear values underlying the MOI Museums of Impact framework, and they are connected to those kinds of values that Jette was beginning with: democracy, sustainable societies, strengthening communities, having a dialogue, being open, and being part of the society that surrounds us. So I have some quotes here from people who are more knowledgeable about such things than I am about the way we currently see the role of museums in society. And although these are, of course, not directly quoted, I just wanted to show you some examples of how we formulate the role of museums in society today in the best possible way, and these kinds of ways of formulating the role of museums and what kind of impacts we are talking about when we talk about the museums of impact. What kind of impact is it that we are looking for? I think I like this way of putting it, what's the relevance of museums in today's society, very much, which is a quote from an article in the Museum Next platform, that museums are just as important for the future as the future is to museums. So we all hope that there is future for museums, but I think we can be very certain that the future will be better with museums as well. This was my message about the tool that we have, but also the meaning why we think it's a good tool for museums to use if they want to have impact. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was also an introduction to the workshops to those who are going, or the others who still join. My proposal is that we will take the questions to the workshops unless someone who is not joining needs to ask something or clarify something. No? All right, in this case I'm saying thank you once more for the work and for the presentation, because I hope we are doing something relevant for the museums. And although this was the final talk of the conference, I would think that our conference is not over yet, because we have 3 parts upcoming. There is a coffee break part upcoming, there is a workshop part upcoming, and we also open a small exhibition, as said repeatedly today, after everything else is over. And I would like to thank all the people to help to organize this day today. We really wanted to pack everything we missed for 2 years into one day. So Agnes, thank you, and thank you the technical team and all the backstage whom you can't see here. And thank you once more for the presenters and everyone who showed up either here as a visible community or people online. I haven't checked how many people are there, but I hope you enjoyed the day too. But now the rest of the day is for those on-site only, so saying goodbye for the online audiences. Agnes, would you like to make a kind of step into workshops and explain where people have to go after they have had refreshments?
The workshops, we will have 2 of them. One is in English, which Pirjo Hamari will make. The other one is in Estonia, and I will make. So let's try to split those who want to participate to 2. We will manage for sure. So grab a coffee, and we will try to start around the time when it is, and then
let's make a maybe 15 minutes break, right? Because we of course ran out of time. So in this case it's about 5 minutes past. Start to look for the workshop leaders.
35,
please.
The rooms with the lady's name in the left side. Kurrik and Moora.
Kurrik and Moora. All right, thank you very much, and now coffee.